The day I walked into First Meridian Bank on Michigan Avenue and asked to close my account, the branch manager actually laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh. A real, open-mouthed, look at this guy laugh. Like I'd told a joke and he was being generous enough to play along. His name was Preston Caldwell III. He was 34 years old, the son of the bank's regional president, and he had just spent the last 40 minutes at his own family dinner table explaining to me, loudly, clearly, and with the kind of patience you'd use on a slow child, why men like me don't belong in rooms like his. He didn't know what was in my account. He was about to find out. My name is Nathan Briggs. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, in a two-bedroom house that my mother kept together with 2 jobs and a budget written in pencil on the back of a grocery receipt. I graduated from Jefferson High School in 2001, and I did not go to college. Not because I wasn't capable. Because the morning after graduation, my mother's second job disappeared and the math stopped working. I want you to keep that in mind for everything that follows. Before we go any further, if this kind of story means something to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories about people who were counted out, written off, and underestimated, and what they did about it. Drop a comment below and tell me, has someone ever underestimated you because of where you came from? Let's hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, smash that like button. It helps more people find us. Now, let me take you back to where this really started. Her name is Diane Caldwell, before she became Diane Briggs. I met her at a trade expo in Chicago 11 years ago. I was there representing a logistics software company I'd been running out of a rented office in Wicker Park for 3 years. She was there managing the registration booth for a financial services firm downtown. She had this way of handling a room, calm and sharp, like she was always 3 thoughts ahead of everyone else. I was attracted to that immediately. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. She said yes on a Tuesday morning in Grant Park with absolutely no ceremony because I'd planned to do it at dinner and lost my nerve and just asked her while we were walking. She laughed. She said yes. We got married the following spring at a small venue in Evanston. Her family was from the North Shore. Old money, the kind that doesn't announce itself but you feel it the moment you walk in the door. The furniture is expensive but worn. The wine is good, but there's nothing pretentious about the way they pour it. Her father, Gerald Caldwell, was the kind of man who built things quietly over decades. He'd spent 30 years growing a regional bank from a single Wilmette branch into a respected mid-size institution with locations across northern Illinois and southeastern Wisconsin. First Meridian Bank. Gerald was decent to me from the beginning. We didn't have a lot in common, but we found common ground in the things that mattered. We both worked hard, we both kept our word, and we both thought Diane was the smartest person in any room she walked into. His brother, however, was a different story. Roger Caldwell was Gerald's younger brother by 4 years. Same blood, different DNA, if you know what I mean. Roger had grown up watching Gerald build something and had made it his life's mission to benefit from that building without doing any of it himself. He'd been given a branch manager position at the Evanston location 12 years ago after a career that included 3 failed business ventures and 1 very quiet settlement that nobody in the family talked about directly. The position came with a title, a good salary, and a corner office, and Roger had spent those 12 years treating it like a throne. His son was Preston Caldwell III, third of that name, as if the name itself were an accomplishment. He was 34, had a finance degree from Northwestern, and had been brought into the bank 2 years prior as a junior relationship manager at the flagship Michigan Avenue branch. He wore suits that cost more than my first car, and he had the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no by anyone with actual power over your life. I'd met Roger and Preston a handful of times at family events before. This particular dinner, the interactions had been brief and surface level, polite in the way that strangers at a wedding are polite to each other. You exchange words, you smile, you move on. You don't particularly think about it afterward. But this dinner was different. This was a sit-down at Gerald's house in Winnetka, a real family evening, and I was going to be there not as a new face, but as Diane's husband of 6 years, which meant, apparently, that Roger had decided it was time to form an opinion about me. The dinner was for Gerald's 68th birthday. Diane's mother, Helen, had arranged it at the house, a big brick colonial on a quiet street 2 blocks from Lake Michigan. Helen was one of those women who makes a dinner for 15 people look completely effortless, which tells you everything about how hard she was actually working behind the scenes. She'd made roast lamb and a pasta dish, and there was a lemon cake that I'm still thinking about to this day. There were about 12 of us around the table, Diane and me, her parents, Roger and his wife Pamela, Preston and his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Courtney who was perfectly nice and seemed to find the whole evening slightly exhausting in the same way I did, a couple of cousins, Gerald's old college roommate and his wife. The conversation was the kind you get at family dinners, comfortable noise, people catching up, stories being told for the fourth or fifth time. I was doing fine. Diane was doing fine. Everything was fine. And then Roger asked me, in the space of a small pause in the conversation, what I'd studied in school. It wasn't a hostile question on its face. It was the kind of question people ask at family dinners when they don't know what else to ask. But there was something in the way he asked it, a slight lean forward, a slight smile, that told me he already suspected the answer and was interested in seeing what I'd do with it. I told him the truth. I said I graduated high school and went straight into work. Started in warehouse logistics, moved into software, built my own company. Roger nodded slowly, the way people do when they're pretending to process information they've already processed. And then he said, very pleasantly, "Well, that's admirable. Not everyone needs a degree to get by." To get by. I let it sit. Diane's hand found my knee under the table. She knew exactly what she was doing. She's always known when I'm deciding whether to respond. Preston, across the table, had caught the exchange. He looked at me with this expression that I recognized immediately, the look of someone who has just been handed permission to say something he'd been wanting to say. He gave a small smile and said, "What kind of software are we talking about? Like an app?" And there it was. That specific way of asking a question that's really a dismissal dressed up as a question. I explained briefly and without any particular emotion that my company developed supply chain optimization software, routing and inventory systems for mid-sized distributors, that we had about 40 enterprise clients in the Midwest and Southeast, that we'd been growing steadily for 8 years. Preston's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Small business stuff," he said. "That's great. There's a real market for that at the lower end." The lower end. Roger laughed a little at that. Not a big laugh, just a small, satisfied sound. I took a sip of water. Gerald, to his credit, asked me a real question about the business, which distributors we worked with, how we handled integrations with legacy inventory systems. He'd always been curious about operations. We talked for a few minutes and it was a real conversation, the kind where both people are actually listening. But Roger wasn't finished. He came back around toward the end of dinner, during dessert, when the conversation had loosened up the way it does after wine. He started talking about his son's trajectory at the bank, how Preston was going to be running a full portfolio by next year, how the right education and the right connections opened the right doors. And then he looked at me, directly at me, with the smile of a man who has never once worried about whether the lights would stay on. And he said, "Of course, some paths are just harder without the foundation. Nothing wrong with how you did it, Nathan. But there's a ceiling, you know. You can feel it. Men who go to the right. Schools build the right relationships. They learn to see past that ceiling early on." The table went slightly quiet. Diane set down her fork. I looked at Roger for a moment. Then I looked at Preston, who was nodding along like this was the most natural thing in the world. And I said very calmly, "Roger, where does First Meridian hold its primary business accounts?" He blinked. "At the Michigan Avenue branch, mostly. Why?" I nodded. "I'll stop by this week," I said. He looked at me like I'd said something slightly confused. "Sure," he said, and then he turned back to Preston and kept talking. "Here is what Roger Caldwell did not know about me. I want to take you back a little further than the dinner, back to the beginning, because that's where the real story lives. When I graduated from Jefferson High School in Rockford in 2001, I didn't have a plan. What I had was a part-time job at a regional shipping warehouse on South Alpine Road, and a mother who needed me to keep that job. So I kept it. I got good at it. I started noticing things. The way routes were organized, the way handoffs between shifts created bottlenecks, the way one small inefficiency could cascade across an entire day of operations. I started making notes. Not because anyone asked me to, just because I couldn't stop seeing the patterns. 6 years into that warehouse work, I was running the floor scheduling and I'd put together a system, nothing digital, just an elaborate spreadsheet and a physical board that cut our average fulfillment time by something like 22%. My supervisor at the time, a guy named Harold Kinsey who wore the same Carhartt jacket every single day from October through April, pulled me into his office one afternoon and said, "Briggs, Somebody's going to patent this and make money off it if you don't. I'd never thought about it that way. That something I built out of frustration with inefficiency could be a product, could be a company. It took me 3 more years. I saved. I took a night course in basic programming at Rock Valley College, not a degree, just enough to understand what I was asking developers to build. I found a partner, a developer in Milwaukee named Craig, who worked with me for 6 months on a prototype we could actually demo. We drove to every mid-sized distributor in the Midwest we could get a meeting with. Most of them said no. Some of them said not yet. A few of them said yes. That's how you build a company when nobody hands you anything. You drive to the meeting. By the time I moved to Chicago and set up the office in Wicker Park, we had 7 paying clients and real revenue. By the time I met Diane at that trade expo, we had 23. By the time we got married, 31. And then, 5 years before that birthday dinner, I made the decision that most people in my position thought was too aggressive, too risky, and too early. I had a profitable company, solid client base, growing revenue, good margins. And I decided to push into a new vertical, cold chain logistics software for pharmaceutical distribution. It was a crowded space, expensive to break into. I spent 18 months developing a compliance tracking module that could integrate directly with FDA documentation requirements. I lost 2 employees during that stretch who thought I was overextending. I ate through a significant portion of my reserves. There were 3 months in that period where I did not take a salary because the reserves were more important than my comfort, and I needed the company to survive the development phase. Diane knew. She never once suggested I pull back. That's who she is. And then I got a contract with a mid-size pharmaceutical distributor out of Indianapolis. And then they referred us to a larger one in Cincinnati. And then we landed a 3-year enterprise deal with a regional hospital network in Ohio. And that deal led to 2 more. And by the time I was sitting at Gerald Caldwell's birthday dinner eating Helen's roast lamb and listening to Roger explain my ceiling to me, my company had revenues that would have rearranged Roger Caldwell's assumptions considerably. I also had an account at First Meridian Bank, a business operating account I'd opened 4 years earlier as a convenience. The branch near my office on Wacker Drive had a good relationship banking team, and the terms were straightforward at the time. I'd moved a significant amount of operating capital into that account over time. $4,200,000. That was what was sitting in my account at the Michigan Avenue branch of First Meridian Bank, the bank that Roger's brother had built, the bank where Preston was building his polished career, the bank where I was just a high school graduate who ran small business stuff at the lower end. I want to be clear about something. I didn't walk into that bank to cause a scene. I want you to understand that. I walked in because I'd been thinking about moving that account for a couple of months. The fee structure had changed and there were better options. And the dinner simply made my timeline slightly more immediate. I walked into the Michigan Avenue branch on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Gerald's birthday dinner, wearing a jacket I'd bought at Nordstrom on Michigan Avenue specifically because I was about to walk into a building on Michigan Avenue and I wanted to be dressed like someone who belonged there. The branch was what you'd expect from a flagship location on one of the most expensive streets in America. High ceilings, polished stone floors, the kind of quiet that costs money to achieve. The kind of place that is specifically designed to make certain people feel at home, and other people feel like they've wandered into the wrong room. I have walked into rooms like that my entire career. Every time I remind myself the same thing. I belong here because of what I built, not because of whose name is on the door. I asked to see a relationship manager. I was shown to a desk where a young woman named Alexis greeted me warmly, pulled up my account, and immediately, and I mean immediately, her expression shifted from professional warmth to something more attentive. She excused herself for a moment. 2 minutes later, Preston Caldwell walked out of an interior office. He stopped when he saw me. For just a fraction of a second, you could see his mind working, connecting the face to the dinner table, connecting the dinner table to the account that had just appeared on Alexis's screen. You could see the moment where his brain produced a number and the number did not match the picture he had formed of me over lamb and lemon cake in Winnetka. "Nathan," he said. He extended his hand. His smile was different from the one at the dinner table. More careful, more present. "I didn't know you banked with us. Come on back." We sat in his office. He offered me coffee. I said no. He offered me water. I said no. He sat down and folded his hands on his desk with the composed expression of someone who has been trained to project calm in unexpected situations. "What can I help you with today?" he asked. "I'd like to close my account," I said. He looked at me. He was still smiling, but it had become the smile of someone trying to figure out if this is a test. "Close your account," he repeated. "Yes." "Nathan, your account has—" he glanced at his screen. "Significant holdings. Is there something that's prompted this? A concern about the bank, service issue, fee structure? Because I'd really like the opportunity to address whatever—" "Preston," I said. "I've thought about it and I'd like to close the account." He leaned back slightly. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me at the dinner table, not hostile exactly, but with that same faint condescension working against itself now, like he was trying to pull it back but didn't quite know how. He said, "Our account holders at this level generally don't make this kind of move without at least discussing the matter with a senior relationship officer." "What level is this?" I asked. He paused. "I'm sorry?" "You said at this level. What level is that?" He turned the screen slightly so I could see the balance. $4,212,000. "I know what's in my account," I said. There was a silence that I will remember for a long time. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that fills a room and makes both people aware of it simultaneously. Preston's jaw was doing something subtle and interesting. He was a professional. I'll give him that. And he recovered quickly. He sat forward again, folded his hands on the desk, and said, "Nathan, I want to apologize. For the other night, at the dinner." He was choosing his words with the kind of care that means the words aren't actually sorry. They're strategic. "I think some things came across poorly. My father can be—" "I'm not here about the dinner," I said. "I'm here to close my account." "Of course." He reached for his phone. "Let me get our senior relationship manager in here too. You can handle it." Another pause. I watched him process the specific dignity of that. That I was not going to let him hand me off to someone more senior. That I was going to make him sit in this chair and process this transaction himself. And then I was going to get up and walk out of his bank, and he was going to have to explain to his supervisor why a $4 million account had just walked out the door on his watch. He handled it professionally. I'll give him that too. He pulled up the forms. He walked me through the process without rushing or fumbling. He asked if I wanted a cashier's check or a wire transfer. I said wire transfer to an account at Lakeshore Bank, which is where I'd already set up the receiving account the previous afternoon. He processed it without speaking for several minutes. I could hear the quiet office noise around us. Keyboards, a phone somewhere, the faint sound of traffic through the glass. All of it carrying on as normal while something irreversible happened at this desk. When he finally looked up, he said, "Is there anything I can do to change your mind?" I thought about Roger's voice at that dinner table, that word, ceiling, like it was a natural feature of a landscape I'd never be tall enough to clear. Like it had been installed by someone official, and there was nothing to be done about it except accept its existence and find a comfortable place to stand underneath it. "No," I said. "I want you to know," Preston said quietly, "that your business is valued here." "I know you do," I said. And I stood up and shook his hand and walked out through the lobby and onto Michigan Avenue, where it was a sharp, clear November morning with the kind of sky you only get in Chicago when the wind comes off the lake and cleans everything out. The kind of air that makes you feel like you've got your whole life in front of you. I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment, breathed that air. Then I got in my car and drove back to my office. I want to tell you what happened after that, because the story doesn't end in the bank. Diane found out what I'd done that evening when I told her over dinner at our kitchen table in Lincoln Square. She listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did it feel as good as you thought it would?" I thought about it honestly. "Better," I said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. "My father is going to hear about this," she said. He did. Gerald called me 2 days later. He was measured on the phone, the way he always was. He said he'd heard about the account closure and he wanted to understand what happened. I told him about the dinner as calmly and factually as I could, without editorializing, without drama. I just laid out what Roger had said, what Preston had said, and what I'd done. There was a long pause, and then Gerald said, "Nathan, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up at that table." I told him I didn't blame him for his brother's behavior. I meant it. "Roger can be difficult," Gerald said. "He's always had this chip about what other people have and where it came from. I've talked to him about it more times than I can count." He paused. "I'll talk to him again." I don't know exactly what Gerald said to Roger after that conversation. Diane heard from her mother that it was significant, that Gerald was more direct with Roger than he'd ever been, that some things were said that had needed to be said for a long time. What I know is that Roger called me 3 weeks later. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. We met at a place on Oak Street on a Saturday morning. He was there when I arrived, sitting at a small table by the window with his hands wrapped around a mug. He looked older than he had at the dinner. Not in a bad way, in the way of a man who's spent some time thinking. He told me he'd been wrong. He said it simply and without a lot of preamble, which I respected. He said he had a habit of measuring people by credentials that he himself had been handed rather than earned, and that it was a habit he wasn't proud of and had let go on too long. I listened. He asked if there was anything I was working on that might be a fit for First Meridian's business clients, whether there was a conversation to be had about partnerships, referrals, the kind of thing that could be mutually beneficial. I said I'd think about it. I'm still thinking about it. Preston, for his part, reached out a few weeks after that. A handwritten note which surprised me. He said he'd done some research on my company after I left the bank, which I believe because what else do you do when you lose a $4 million account? And that he'd been surprised by what he found. He said he thought he'd made an assumption at the dinner that was unfair, and he apologized for it. I wrote back, not a long letter, just acknowledgement that I'd received it and that I appreciated the gesture. Because here is the thing I've learned about the people who underestimate you. They are sometimes the loudest part of the story, but they're never the most important part. The most important part is what you did before they ever showed up. The years you put in when no one was watching. The decisions you made in the middle of the night when the numbers weren't working. The thing you built without their approval and without their pedigree and without their ceiling. I think about my mother sometimes when I'm in a meeting with people who have offices like Preston's. She wrote our family budget in pencil because she knew it was going to change. She kept going anyway. She never had a ceiling in her mind. She had a list. Just the next thing on the list. And then the next one. That's where I learned it. Not from a university. Not from a family with a bank in its name. From a woman in Rockford, Illinois who worked 2 jobs and kept a pencil sharp. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something real. Who told you that you had a ceiling? What specific moment did someone look at where you came from, your zip code, your degree, your last name, your bank account, and decide they already knew how high you could go? And more importantly, what did you build when they weren't looking? Because the $4 million was never the point. The point was that it existed. The point was that it existed because of years of work that no one in that dining room in Winnetka had witnessed. Years that didn't look impressive on paper because I didn't have a paper that told the story the way Preston's did. The point was standing on Michigan Avenue in the November cold and breathing that clean lake air. The point was choosing where my money lives. Roger Caldwell still runs the Evanston branch of First Meridian. Gerald has mostly stepped back from day-to-day operations. Preston, I heard recently, is doing well. He got a promotion last year and by all accounts has become a more careful listener than he used to be. People grow. I believe that. Diane and I have dinner with her parents most months when we're in the city. Helen still makes that lemon cake. My company just signed a contract with a national pharmaceutical distributor headquartered in Philadelphia. It's the largest single deal we've ever closed. I keep my banking at Lake Shore. The fee structure is better and no one there has ever asked me what school I went to. I graduated from Jefferson High School in 2001. That is the only degree I have ever held. I'm not ashamed of it. I never have been. But I'll tell you something. I walked into that bank on a Thursday morning, and I sat across from a man who had explained to me very clearly where my ceiling was, and I watched him process $4 million out of his branch and into someone else's, and I thought about ceilings for a long time after that. I think they're real, actually. I think ceilings exist. I've hit a few over the years. The thing about ceilings, though, is that they're not made out of anything permanent. They're made out of other people's assumptions, and assumptions are the one thing in this world that doesn't cost a single thing to walk away from.